So as we get ready for the next section here, we're going to be looking at theological anthropology. We've been talking a lot in these first 8 or 9 talks about the God that reveals God's self. Who is this God? And sought to establish an understanding of revelation that is both Trinitarian and cruciform, and also takes into account the difference between the Janus-faced gods of religion and the Father of Jesus. Okay, so we got that far. So as I'm getting ready now to move into the other side of that relationship, so we have the divine communication, then we have the human hearer of that communication. We've talked about the human hearer in terms of rejection of the message and acceptance of the message, and the role that pistis or trust plays in this. So as I'm getting ready now for the last couple of weeks to do this talk on theological anthropology, the first time I drafted my notes, I started out with, of course, secularity and secular views of the human being, and you know, from philosophy and sociology and this and that. And the problem was is that I ended up boxing myself in the first time I did this into nihilism. It was rather strange to me to realize that I had I had a starting place, and that starting place led to nihilism. So okay, I'm going to redo this. I'm going to redo this. And then I did it again. So I'm thinking, okay, now I can work this model, and I felt real good about it. And I'll share with you in a minute what was funny about this whole process. But as I worked down now through the model, where I ended up was with some Calvinist doctrine of election. I thought, well, that's weird. You know, the first time I went through it, ended up in nihilism. The second time I ended up in kind of a theological nihilism, that double predestination. But I couldn't figure out the mistake I was making. And so I kept puzzling and puzzling on this. And I finally had to sit down with Cheryl and say, I'm stuck, you know, this is where I'm stuck. And she helped me realize that what I was doing was putting the cart before the horse. And that what I needed to do was follow the principles that I've laid out for you, which is we begin all of our thinking from the Trinity, from the cross, from the person of God. And theological anthropology, in this sense, starts with Jesus. But I didn't start with Jesus. I started with, you know, secular thinking both times. And once I realized that error, I said, "Oh, you know, I'm way too Barthian, influenced by Karl Barth, to have done what I did. What I did was essentially the kind of the scholarly approach, you know, and looking at issues of what it means to be human and this and that and the other. And they have a few books on theological anthropology. It's not a huge topic in terms of the macro picture, but the one by Pannenberg had its influence on me some decades ago. So I thought I'm going to go back and see what Pannenberg did, and I got his theological anthropology out, and sure enough, you know, he had dealt with a lot of the same things that I was wrestling with in my lecture. And so I felt like this was the right way to go, but it really wasn't, not for me. And I mean, Pannenberg's book's a phenomenal book. If you have a chance to ever engage it, you will be richly, richly rewarded. But we're a good 30, 40 years down the road from that, and there's been a lot of thinking that's been done in the sciences on what it means to be human. And so I said to myself, okay, I've got to start at the starting place. So what I want to do is I want to raise some questions for you, because my goal is not to tell you what anthropology is, or even what theological anthropology is. My goal here today is to frame a way of conceiving what it means to be human, um, that is able to take into account not just the biblical understanding of what's going on. And by biblical, I don't mean the Bible gives us an anthropology. It kind of does and it kind of doesn't. Um, uh, but we're going to take those parts where it kind of does, and we're going to work those. And the beauty of this is that when we start there, we can easily move into then and negotiate with the scientific traditions, whatever they're learning in those disciplines about what it means to be human. Back prior to Socrates, before 350 BCE, there was a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus. And Heraclitus, you might know him from his famous saying, you can't step into the same river twice because the river is always flowing and changing. Change is, part of reality. But when Heraclitus looked around, he was looking for that which basically, what was it that defined us as human beings? What was it that structures our world, our universe? And as he looked around, he realized that it was conflict, and he used the term polemos. We translate as war or conflict. And he argued that polemos was the logos. It was the structuring principle of reality. And that is a really, really important anthropological insight. We are structured by our conflicts. And of course, you don't have Heraclitus, or we don't have very few of his sayings, fragments of his sayings, so we don't know where he went with that. But just a few generations later, Aristotle, in his rhetoric, would connect desire and rivalry and conflict together. And the Greek philosophical tradition is beginning to see these things. And Girard, of course, makes some great use of the Greek dramatists as those who are beginning to see the mechanism of what it means to be human and to engage in conflict and then to engage in mob conflict against a scapegoat. And so we find these things in the Greek philosophical tradition. Girard has written a book on sacrifice in the Vedic tradition, the Indian tradition, and sees the same thing there, the same phenomenon. There's this kind of both sacrificial and non-sacrificial thinking in that tradition, just as there's going to be in the Jewish tradition, just as there's going to be in the Christian tradition. Now, I can't speak to Islam. I don't know the Quran or Islamic belief or practice that well. It may well be that Islam contains both a sacrificial and a non-sacrificial component. I don't know. That would be for someone else that's versed in that. But I can say that the Christian, the Indian, the Vedic tradition, and the Jewish tradition all contain sacrificial and non-sacrificial elements and Greek philosophy. So there's something happening here in these centuries before Jesus comes on the scene globally, and even before that, where there's this awareness that something is wrong with this business of sacrificial religion. And this was apparent all the way back already in 800 BCE with Zoroaster, who seeks to uh, bring together, as it were, in one worldview, the relationship between sacrificial and non-sacrificial in his thinking. And from that, of course, we know the influence that's going to have on Second Temple Judaism and further. There's a quote I want to begin with here. It comes out of a book I read or was reading on Wycliffe recently. And the quote is from a writer, Dahan, Dahan. He says, theology is a science, but the text upon which it is founded is not a scientific text. And as we come to Holy Scripture, and we want to approach it as rationally as we can, but we want to recognize that the biblical writers were just like us. They were seeking to understand the work of this creator God in their world at their time. And but they were ensconced, as it were, in their worldview, just as we are. And this is where I made my error in starting off this lecture wrong twice. Um, I I had not yet been able to, as it were, kind of stand outside all the stuff that's been put in my head for 67 years and look at it through this different lens. But of course, once I was able to make that shift and place theological anthropology, reflection on the person of Jesus as a true human, bam, then everything followed in its train. So with Heraclitus, we recognize that the world, at least, is structured on conflict. That is, everything that moves us is usually in relation to something that is challenging us, and that's often a person. And so I just want to hang on to that little bit of anthropological insight from Heraclitus. Of course, you know where I'm going to go with this with mimetic theory down the road, but it's still important to hang on to that. When we talk about what it means to be human, who is this human being that receives this revelation of God? If we begin by asking what it is that the sciences are going to tell us, we have any number of ways to understand the human being, but we're going to end up, no matter where we're at in all of this, in one of two places, either a determinism or a hedonism. So what I'd like to do is just kind of walk you through a little bit of some of the things that are important in the study of anthropology from my perspective as a Christian thinker that we need to keep in our minds as we come to the biblical text, because the way we think about these things is going to inform what we say about them. What is anthropology? It's simply the study and the definition of what it means to be a human being. And anthropology is a discipline that it's about 150 years old, maybe a little less, begins in the mid to late 19th century as a discipline and many forms. So when I say anthropology now, you have to stop and go, okay, what kinds of disciplines are included in anthropology? Well, one of the first ones we have is archaeology, the study of human beings in the past. And the archaeologists of the 19th century, it's an interesting story, particularly the archaeology of the Holy Land and how absolutely crazy it was, and how these early archaeologists, I mean, they destroyed sites, looking for things, and eventually they would develop the tools so that they could go to a dig site and they could dig it out very carefully, very properly, and come away with a whole lot more information and evidence than they did, say, in the last half of the 19th century. Another discipline that will arise in the latter half of the 19th century is the psychoanalytic tradition under Freud. And Freud's thinking had, as you know, an enormous impact on how we understand human beings. There's another tradition that arises in anthropology, and that's political science kind of thinking. And the key thinker here is Karl Marx. And Marx's understanding of the human being as an alienated figure. You also have in philosophy a theology developed by Nietzsche. And it's a nihilistic anthropology in the end, and we can see the upshot of what it means when Nietzsche is taken with all seriousness and misinterpreted a bit, but all seriousness by the Nazis in the 1930s in Germany. We also now have today tools that we didn't have before. We can understand the brain. And so we look at the human brain. What is it that drives us? What is it that moves us? And we can talk about behaviors. We can talk about chemical reactions. We can talk about mirror neurons. There's many, many different ways we can talk about the human brain. Um, do we have free will? Do we get to choose, or are we determined? These philosophical questions continue to play a role, even in the neurological research about what it means to be a human being. What is consciousness? What does it mean for us to be conscious? Are we conscious? Is there a difference between consciousness and awareness? I mean, it used to be thought that that which distinguished us, which made us human, were things like rationality and language and emotion. But we've discovered now, since then, that not only do humans have emotion, but so do animals. Animals experience emotion. Anybody that's a dog owner knows this one real clear. But it goes deeper than that. The plant life also experiences what we would term feelings. Okay, don't tell the vegans that, but that is the case. And so the things that we thought distinguished us before from the creation itself are no longer distinguishing characteristics. We know, for example, that dolphins have a very, very intricate communication structure. I'm not going to use language or words, but I'm going to use communication structure. We just happen to have words. Um, there are the religious viewpoints of what it means to be human. And religious viewpoints here become very, very important because the dominant, in our tradition, the Christian tradition, the dominant view has until the 20th century come to us from our anthropology is essentially Augustinian. We human beings are utterly depraved and sinful. We can't do anything right. We hurt each other. We hurt God. We disobey God. We disobey the authorities. We're thoroughly corrupt. And of course, this will play itself in Calvinism in a big way and in the Reformed tradition, so much so that we can essentially see ourselves as worms. And this brings us to identity issues. Now, identity issues form an awful lot of the discourse in anthropology today. Wasn't always the case. But for the last 40, 50 years, identity has become very, very important. And if you try to play these out as I did, looking for the implications of the implications of the implications, you'll find that all of these things that are being learned in these scientific disciplines about what it means to be human are true, but they're also the result of scientists doing their thinking and experimenting within a certain frame of reference, a certain worldview. And the sad thing is that it is the rare book that is able to take all of this into consideration and talk about the human being. So, as you're constructing your anthropology, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean for you to be a human being? You can get lost, I mean, absolutely lost in the philosophy, in the religious, in the neurological, the biological, the sociological. We haven't talked about the sociology yet, and what it means to be human in terms of groups, communities, society, and culture. We haven't talked about evolutionary biology or paleoanthropology, in the evolutionary process, how we became human. And at this point, the evidence base for anthropology comes from things like bones, books, myths, rituals, artifacts, and events. And all of these play together as we begin asking, who are we as human beings? And what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be human? We can also add to this because we experience it, whereas sociology will talk about the um, social nature of religion. It contrasts very, very sharply with the notion of the individual, as we find in the Enlightenment, Western Enlightenment tradition, where we are all essentially our own unique person. Our desires are our desires, our will is our will. And we have relationships with each other, but it's in the form of a social contract. Okay. Um, when Freud opened up the can of worms, that there's this thing called the non-conscious or the unconscious, and Jung carried that further, and it's continued to carry on in many, many, many psychological traditions, that we are somehow just only slightly conscious, and then there's this thing called the unconscious, the non-conscious part of ourselves that kind of drives us, and many of you are aware of this, and some of you have even had some experiences of this. And it's not that this is false. It's not that Freud was wrong. It's not that Jung was wrong. It's not that the behaviorists are wrong. It's not that the neurology people are wrong. It's not that the philosophers are wrong. It's that they're doing all of their thinking, okay, in looking at the human being, but they're framing it really in terms of Heraclitus. They're looking at conflict. And so you can come all the way up in the history of the West to Hegel. And for Hegel, it's this conflict, this thesis, antithesis, synthesis that is what moves history forward. And of course, Karl Marx is going to make a lot of hay about conflict between the classes. And Nietzsche is going to make real hay in the conflict between Christianity and Greek philosophical thought. Where do we start in our anthropological thinking? Do we just simply pick up books that describe to us the human condition, or do we need to start somewhere else? And as I said before, my mistake was beginning or trying to begin with what was out there in the secular world, and then come along and fit theological anthropology into that. It doesn't work. I had to begin the other way around. I have to start this lecture with talking about the the revelation of what it means to be a human being. And where do we find that? Well, in the Christian tradition, primarily, when you go talking about what it means to be a human being, you are going to be led to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where the human couple, the male and female, are created in the image and likeness of God. Image being the Greek term icon, we English word is icon, and the likeness, the homeotati, the similarities, okay. And so we have this being made in this image and in this likeness of God. And from there, what we do, if we're going to follow the standard Christian tradition, is we're going to try and engage these nouns. What does it mean to be made in the image? What does it mean to be made in the likeness of God, and so forth? And throughout the history of Christianity, again, we began early on pegging rationality as that which we are. We're rational beings, therefore God is rational. We use language, therefore God uses language. And you can now begin to see the influence of this kind of thinking on the Reformed tradition, which again is the mother of evangelicalism and fundamentalism. This is the wrong place to begin. Where do we begin? We begin our thinking about what it means to be human, the same place we begin our thinking about who is this God. We begin with the figure Jesus of Nazareth. We cannot know God or the Father apart from Jesus in the same way. We cannot know ourselves and what it means to be human apart from Jesus. A little short break there. So we begin with Jesus. He's the one that's going to inform us as to what it means to be a true human being. Now, there's a difference between what we want to describe as the self and the category of personhood. And Gil Bailey has done a tremendous amount of work on this. And he has a brand new book out, and for the life of me, I forget the title. That's very, very good on this. That we have to distinguish between self and person. That is the category of self that we use to describe ourselves, and then what it is that the gospel brings as it turns us away from being a self to being a person. And so that's going to become important as we move through these talks. What I realized in this is if we begin with Jesus, we're able to solve a number of problems that, for my money, cannot be solved by a purely secular approach to anthropology. A secular approach to anthropology cannot deal with the problem of evil. It has the most difficult time with that. And in the same way, it can't solve for the problem of sin. Partly because it doesn't acknowledge sin, because there is no God. But what it ends up doing is creating social codes that one follows, and or not. And finally, it can't solve really for the problem of separation. No matter how hard secular anthropology tries to deal with the issue of human conflict and separation, it doesn't seem to be able to create an ethos, an environment, a worldview where there is peace, where there is harmony, where we all do, in fact, get along. Okay. It has its utopias, it has its visions, but an awful lot of these are inspired by the Christian tradition, even if that is not acknowledged, or even if the Christian tradition is rejected. These secular theories still contain within them these seeds of hope that Christianity has sown for 2,000 years. So if we're going to develop a way of what it means to be human, as you're going about this, okay? And you're going to be reading books on gender and identity, um, uh, human groups. You're going to be perhaps interested in reading books about brains and the brain mind, or dialectic or consciousness, or whatever you're reading. You're going to always need to keep that, in a sense, in a penultimate place. It's not the final word. The final word is Jesus. The final word is who he is as a human being. He's the true human. And from there, we can make our thinking happen, and we can integrate the sciences. So where do we begin? The Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 4:4 says that Jesus is the icon, the image of God. Jesus is the image. Now, it's true that the Genesis text says that Adam and Eve, the male, or I should say the male and the female in the first creation narrative, it's not Adam and Eve yet, it's just the male and the female, are made in the image of God. And here we come to Paul, who says that Jesus is made in the image of God. Again, a lot of the tradition is going to argue that image or likeness has to do with reason or language or some kind of connection that we think we can make between ourselves and divinity. But it was in the 1930s that Dietrich Bonhoeffer first, and then Karl Barth second, made the connection that to be made in the image of God is to be made in relationship. That is, there is a social character to the image of God. It's the relational element that makes the image. And of course, we can tie that real nicely back into the doctrine of the Trinity and the relationship between the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And we're made as humans in that same way to relate in love, just as they do. And you can derive all of that if you want to do a Christian reading of Genesis chapter 1. And then you come to Genesis chapter 2, where the male is given a name, the female is given a name, and we have a quite different narrative than we do in the first creation narrative. In the first creation narrative, everything is peachy keen and it ends, with 7 days, and God, Elohim, sees that it's all very, very good. And then in the second narrative, it's really not all very, very good. And I've said this to you before. When you don't recognize you have two creation stories, and the first creation story is a story that's structured in the same way as ancient mythologies, where the creation is essentially a temple. And so as we move in the Genesis narrative, and I believe it's John Walton's book that really brings this out, his book In the Beginning. We move from the outside to the inside, to the Holy of Holies, and the Holy of Holies is the creation of the human. Okay? And by human, I don't mean one solitary figure. I'm talking about the human as a species in relationship. Okay, so that's that temple narrative, and it all ends very well. Now, I'm going to argue that in fact Genesis 1 does not belong in the category of protology. That is, it's not about creation, it's eschatological. It says that from the moment God starts the process, let there be light, to the end of the process, everything is very, very good. God is the one that makes all things work together for good. That's the first creation narrative. It's eschatological in character. And it's also important to note that this is a creation temple structured narrative that has no blood in it. Unlike other creation mythology stories, there's always a sacrifice of a god or a human or something, but not in the Genesis text. The Genesis text starts off talking about creation as a temple, the human being at the center of that temple, the Holy of Holies, but there's no blood to get there. There's no sacrifice. That's the astonishing thing about that text. And for my money, it sets us up for the biblical narrative now to be able to establish the case that in fact God is not like the God of Genesis 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and so on. I'm not saying that there's not that God, the Father, isn't working in that story, that there's not a role for God in that story. What I'm saying is that the second creation narrative already presupposes a sacrificial system because there's a law in place, and law comes after the ritual sacrificial process. Remember, and I'm using mimetic theory here, what comes first? Sacrifice. What comes out of sacrifice? Ritual, myth, the linguistic telling of the story where we were right to do what we did, but also law, things that prohibit us from engaging in mimetic behaviors with one another so that we don't end up in mimetic conflict, so that we don't end up in that scapegoating process. The second creation narrative, when read through the lens of the mimetic theory, in particularly chapters 3 and 4, which belong together. And you ask me, how do you know they belong together? Well, Jesus made the connection between this devil figure as both a liar, Genesis 3, and a murderer, Genesis 4. These texts belong together. And this is not my insight. Jacques Ellul makes that argument. Bonhoeffer makes that argument. Barth makes that argument. And others have made that argument, and including the mimetic theorists, as Girard and others. The reason they belong together is that they show us very clearly, I think, the relationship between desire and the imitation of desire, where that leads, and the consequences of it as we move into the Cain and Abel story, the murder of Abel, the marking of Cain, the escalation of violence in Lamech, the escalation of violence globally now, according to the text in Genesis 6, the earth was full of violence. And finally, the humans attempt to deal with all of this by creating a sacrificial system, the Tower of Babel. It's a ziggurat where there's going to be human sacrifice that takes place to raise that to divine status. In other words, we're gonna build this thing to heaven, they say. What are they really saying? They're saying we're gonna get the divine imprimatur for this way of thinking. And of course, God has to come down and say that's not going to work and has to scatter them. The two creation narratives give us two very, very different understandings of the human being. The first creation narrative, God does this wonderful, beautiful thing, it's finished. And then in the second, but it's not totally finished. And the reason that I can say that is that when God says it was very, very good, it was tov tov. For it to be most excellent or best, it would have to be tov tov tov, would be one way for the Hebrew to be superlative. The second narrative shows why this is so. The second narrative is going to deal with the problem of evil. And you'll notice, by the way, that in chapter 3, the word sin isn't mentioned. Okay? Sin comes in chapter 4. Sin is the croucher outside of Cain's door, ready to come in. If he opens that up, it's going to come in, and there's going to be a consequence to this mimetic behavior of the couple, the Adam and Eve couple. There's going to be a consequence in that mimetic behavior, which leads to all manner of blaming and shaming in the Genesis 3 text, turns into a religious battle between Cain and Abel, and there's already sacrifice presupposed here. Notice it's not commanded anywhere, it's just presupposed. And that tells you that the Genesis 2 text is thinking through anthropology from below, from the brokenness of reality, whereas the Genesis 1 text is looking at the great big picture, and that the whatever brokenness there is healed, so to speak, and everything works out well. And don't forget that the first creation narrative was written probably by a priest in Babylon, where the Jews had 70 years there. And I'm not sure where in the process of the 70 years this creation narrative is written, but it's written in direct distinction to the Babylonian Tiamat myth, the Enuma Elish, which again is blood and sacrifice and death and murder and everything else. Well, the second biblical story is going to pick up those themes that are found in ancient mythology, okay, like the Enuma Elish, but it's going to, instead of keeping them in the realm of the divine, it's going to place them squarely on human shoulders. That is, sin, evil, murder, death. These are all phenomena that come as a result of human beings imitating each other, ending up in rivalries and conflict, as Heraclitus saw. If we want to start our understanding of image of God from creation, we're going to run into a myriad of problems simply because we have the two creation stories. And so you can do what some want to do and say, look, we have an original blessing narrative. This is original blessing. We were created just fine. And then something happened, and we really don't want to call it sin or anything, but something happened. And so as a result, we're no longer in that blessing, but we're meant to be in that blessing. And you're familiar, some of you, with Matthew Fox or a charismatic reading of the text. However you want to do it, the problem is you're going to end up having to go from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 and 3. And the only way you can do that is through that model of a fall. Okay? I'm saying rather than seeing this original, everything was perfect and we somehow fell from a state of grace. No, everything has, as we've moved through time, space, and history, is really an awful lot like Genesis 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. That is, our world feels very much like that. It's full of conflict and rivalry and violence and war and destruction and sacrifice, all those themes that we see in that early Genesis mythology. But the first narrative, the humans being made in the image and likeness of God, is something that would have struck the New Testament writers square in the face. Because when they looked at Jesus, they saw Jesus as the icon of God. Jesus was the image of the Father, not the Adam of the Genesis text. The Adam of the Genesis text is already a, quote, fallen figure. Okay, because the Genesis 2 text presupposes all those mechanisms by which we as human beings evolved from our simian ancestors to hominids and then structured ourselves with sacrifice. That's what distinguishes us from the animals. We are the species that uses sacrifices to create social relationships. Okay? Now, if Jesus is the icon of God, he's also the likeness of God. We see this in Philippians, the 2nd chapter, where Paul says, Jesus, who being in the likeness of God. And we can almost use image and likeness interchangeably, can't we? Right? And so there's no need to do what the Christian tradition has done to say, well, the image is intact, but the likeness is not intact, but the image is intact. They're just synonyms. The fact is, the human being is not the image of the Father. The human being might be the image of a God concept, where God concepts are Janus-faced. If your God concept is Janus-faced and you're made in the image of God, you're going to be Janus-faced as well. Okay? And you're going to find all kinds of ways to justify the other side, the dark side of this God concept, which includes justification of sacrifice, justification of war, justification of anger, justification of the things that break down human social relations. Now, Jesus as the image and likeness of God doesn't take away the social element, because the social element's right there in the familial relationship of the Father and the Son. There's your sociality. And there's a further sociality, of course, when we begin to talk about the work of the Holy Spirit. And so we have this Trinitarian set of relations that we are made in the image of. I'm sorry, that Jesus is the image of this in his person. Not that we are made in the image of. There's the mistake I keep making over and over. Jesus is the image and likeness of the Father. He is our model of behavior. This is the whole point of the discipleship paradigm. I mean, it seems to me that one of the real problems that we've run up against as we talk about being a human being is we talk about it in these very isolationist, individualist types of models that we use for ourselves, because we think we have a self, we think we have a story, we think we have an identity. It's a falsely constructed identity. It's a fault. We create a false narrative of what it means to be human, and so we create false narratives of what it means to be ourselves. And so, I remember back in the 60s and 70s, it was all about be yourself, be yourself. Nobody can be you, you be yourself. And that really works if you buy into the notion of the individual lie, that my desires, that what I want, come from within me. But if I reckon with the fact that all desire is imitative, what it means is there's not a me. I am just a conglomeration of the desires I see in others that I'm copying. Why do I want recognition? Why do I want fame? Why do I want wealth? Why do I want to be in control of things? All the kinds of things that I see other people have and I want, and is I end up becoming nothing more than a a figure that's a conglomeration of others. Okay, and this is really key because the voices that are in our heads are these cultural voices, these parental voices, the teachers we had, the TV we watch, the movies we watch, the books we read. These are all voices in there. They're what one criminologist, Lonnie Aarons, calls our phantom community, and he has studied this in prisoners. Particularly those that are lifers, who have these phantom communities in their heads. And now, of course, with the growth of psychology, we're recognizing that we indeed do, all of us, have these voices. Well, what are these voices? These voices are nothing other than mediated desire. I'm just imitating what I see others doing. And I want what they want because it evidently, the guy that gets the Porsche, he's really happy. He loves his car. Well, hey, I want to be happy too, so I wouldn't mind having a Porsche, right? No, this is not correct thinking, as you know. If we are constituted, if this thing that I call Michael is really nothing other than trying to be somebody else, I'm not a me. That is, there's no I here. This thing that I call an ego or Michael that I can name as myself is really not a reality. The reality is that I am wanting and doing. I'm always transcending myself into others. Okay. What Jesus brings to the table is that he doesn't have the desires of the people in his culture. He's not looking to be rich or famous or anything else. What matters to Jesus is the will of his Father. And apparently that mattered to him from a young age. And the only thing he was interested in was the will of his Father. By the time we get to the baptism narrative in the Gospels, Jesus has already worked through what it means to desire the Father only, just the Father's will. Whatever the Father's will is, that's our desire. And he's done that. And because he's done that, he's able to not desire the desires of others in his culture. He can be reckoned as the icon of the Father, the one who displays the Father's character. And this term is found in Hebrews 1:3, where he is the character of God. His story, his narrative, the exhibition of his behaviors in his mission reveal the character of the Father, or of God, the living God, the true and living God. So Jesus is the icon of God. Jesus is the one that's the true human. It's not for nothing that Jesus' favorite phrase for self-designation, the way he would refer to himself, was the oblique phrase, the Son of Man. And for those of you that have read the Jesus-driven life, you'll be aware that Son of Man could be an apocalyptic figure like the book of Daniel or First Enoch has. The Son of Man could just be a way of saying human being, oh human being, like we find in the book of Ezekiel, where God calls Ezekiel and says, you, Son of Man, meaning you, human being. We also know that Son of Man is a roundabout way, a circumambulatory way, a roundabout way of saying I or myself in Aramaic. So it's all of these, and there are a few others that we could throw in there, but Jesus seemed to realize that this ambiguous phrase, the Son of Man, was excellent for designating who he perceived himself to be as the true human, as the one who became that which was intended in the beginning. Now, you might ask, but is there anywhere in the scriptures that we can follow that logic? And the answer is yes. The Gospel of John, as you know, in the prologue, in the beginning was the Logos was with God, the Logos was God, and nothing was created without the Logos. All that was created in him was life. He was the light that shines in the darkness. The darkness doesn't overcome or understand it. That's all a riff on Genesis 1, isn't it? The first creation narrative. But what's really fascinating is when we get to John 19 and the crucifixion scene, and we know how important the theology of the cross is in the Gospel of John. What we have there is a revelation of something. The words of Jesus in John, where he says, tetelestai, it is finished, have often been taken to refer to atonement. Oh, okay, atonement time is finished. I paid my time on the cross. I paid my dues. Okay, it's all done. Now I can die and be done with this, dying nonsense. No, no. It is finished refers to Jesus as the true human. That is the finishing of the true human, the ultimate creation of this figure throughout the Gospel of John, who ends up giving his life, choosing to give his life for everyone. That is the true human. It is finished means the creation is finished. The old creation is finished on the cross. And you'll recall in John chapter 5, where the Jews were chastising Jesus for, doing things on the Sabbath that they thought shouldn't be done. Jesus has the gall to say, my Father, the Creator, is a creator person today. He's still creating. Or as Jesus says, I am a working man and my Father is a working man also. Um, that is, the narrative is trying to show you that the creation isn't finished, okay? It's not complete until Jesus dies. It's in his dying, how he dies, what he's doing, how he got there, that whole narrative. That is the creation of the true human. And that's how the New Testament writers could look at Jesus and say, now we know what it means to be human. One of the points that's really important here that Gil Bailey makes in his writings is that we learn to first be a self in relation to others. That's what culture gives us. So we learn to talk about our feelings, our thoughts, our desires, our will. And we can either recognize that it's imitated or not, but we're still in the self. But when God raised Jesus from the dead, he forever established the character not only of the true God, but also the true human. So Jesus is the revelation of God, but he's also the revelation of who we are also, okay? We are also there at the cross, okay? Just as the Gospel of John and the other writers have the beloved disciple and his mother and a few other Marys there, so you and I are there. We're represented by the Pharisees, by the Sadducees, by the Roman soldiers, by those in the crowd that would mock him, by the criminals on the cross. We're all there. There's this narrative includes all of us, okay? So one of the things that the narrative reveals about us, again, is this propensity to sacrifice. It's better that one should die than the nation perish. That's the logic of sacrifice that gets bought into so that Jesus ends up getting crucified. But it's in this crucifixion process that reveals the love of the Father that the true human is revealed. What does it mean to be truly human? It means to be willing to lay one's life down for the family of God, or for the Father's will, or however you want to understand that. To be created in the image and likeness of God does not mean we are children of God. And we're going to have to really wrestle this one out. But I want you to now begin to think in kind of different terms, because this is where I ended up in a conundrum. If all human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, we should be able to look at humanity and we should be able to say what God is like. But the reality is, when we look at the human species, we see we see human beings that behave like a Janus-faced God. We see people, secular and religious, behaving identically. We don't see a distinction between the secular and the religious communities. All of them are involved in envy. All of them are involved in mimetic conflict. All of them, in one form or another, are involved in scapegoating. And all of them are involved in hate and discrimination and war. That's, again, that's the underside of being human. It's a false structuring. It's a false reality. And it's only as we are related to Jesus that we can move from self to person. That is, it's only in following him, desiring his desire, which is the desire for the Father and the Father's will, that we become a person, that we actually become children of the Father. There's a big difference in my mind between all human beings being made in the image and likeness of God and being a child of God. They are not the same for me, okay? Children of God will have the Holy Spirit. Children of God will engage in discipleship. They will follow Jesus. They will allow his character to become their character. His teachings about peace, non-retaliation, forgiveness, reconciliation. If you want to put justice in there, feel free, just not the modern liberal notion of justice. That's fine. As we embody that character of Jesus, we become persons. We reflect the Father, and thus we can be children of God. Otherwise, we're not children of God. We might be, quote, made in the image and likeness of God, whatever that means, however we want to understand it. But we're not children of the Father. That's a whole different reality that's brought about by the resurrection, the ascension of Christ, the sending of the Spirit. Now, the mistake I made in the second time I went down the path and started with, secular anthropology and then tried to fit theological anthropology, and I ended up in Calvinism, is because I clearly saw that to be made in the image and likeness of God in Genesis and for Jesus to be the image and likeness of God were two very, very different things. I ended up in that Calvinist double predestination where uh, uh, only the children of God are saved. People made in the image and likeness of God, well, they're screwed because of whatever reason, sin and this and that and the other. What I realized was I can't put the category salvation together with the phrase children of God. Children of God experience this sozo, this salvation, this breaking free from this world, this breaking free from thinking as the world thinks, this breaking free from sacrificial religion. This all comes about as we are listening to Jesus and doing what he says to do. That's where we get constituted as a person. And Bailey points out that it's the introduction of the category person into the doctrine of the Trinity that's going to inform now the rest of the Western tradition's understanding of a person. My objection to the introduction of that term person into the doctrine of the Trinity has primarily to do with the fact that most people understand person individualistically. And that's why the Muslims and others and the Jews and others can say, oh, the Christians have three gods. Well, we would have three gods if we didn't have a way of understanding the interpenetration of the Father and the Son and the Spirit, who all look the same, act the same, and are the same. Just as the Son imitates the Father, the Spirit imitates the Son. Just as the Son emptied himself and took the form of a servant and became a human, so the Spirit empties herself and comes into human existence, our existence, my existence, your existence. And the Spirit is the connection for us with the living Lord Jesus Christ. The Father sends the Spirit through the Son, and the Spirit's work is to remind us constantly of Jesus so that we look like him a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. The anthropology then of the Bible has two sides. It has in the what I would call the revelatory capacity of Scripture, it has the dark side, the Genesis 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 through 11. But it also has that side, the Genesis 1 narrative, that is eschatological in nature, where Christ, Jesus Christ himself, is the true Adam. Paul will call him the second Adam, but he also in the 1 Corinthians 15, but he also refers to Jesus as the type. He is the one created first, and Adam is made in his image and likeness. Unfortunately, as we know, the Adam figure considers equality with God to consist in the act of grasping. I have to take it. I have to take God's godness from God so I can be a God. Whereas Jesus gives that up. He doesn't consider equality with God to consist in the act of grasping. He didn't run around saying, I am God's son. I am the Christ. Look at me. I can do this and this. And he doesn't do that. That's not his modus operandi. To let go of divinity, to let go of the need to be divine, is to let go of the need to transcend into the other, except for transcending into the Father. And so as Jesus gives up any right or any way of thinking that he deserves, I'm God. I shouldn't be, rejected. I shouldn't be killed. No, as he gives all that up, he becomes now filled with the Father. He becomes the one who doesn't grasp. And just as he doesn't grasp, so the Father doesn't grasp. This is really important. The Father doesn't cling. Okay, the Father lets go. The Father creates freedom for us. And this is the beauty of the Trinity when it comes to ourselves, is we are given freedom in the gospel to no longer be a self, but to become a person. And the way we become a person is to engage in this discipleship so that it is the character of Jesus, who is the character of the Father, becomes by the work of the Spirit our character. So that when people look at us, they should be able to say, oh, we see someone who follows Jesus. That's what they should be able to say. I'm going to stop this lecture here, and next week we will pick up on it, or next time we get together, we'll pick up on it and continue our discussion of theological anthropology. What does it mean to be the human being to whom God as Father, Son, and Spirit comes? Okay, thanks. Look forward to seeing you soon.